with was the whole truth and nothing but the truth. You've been talking about kind of climate change. And I think there is a theme there about inclusion and exclusion. You know, who leads the fight on climate change? You know, who's bearing the brunt and impact of climate change? What has contributed to, you know, our world being in decline? And how we tell the real stories behind that in terms of who caused that destruction in the first place. And that it was kind of predominantly for economic benefit. And making sure that those voices are included as opposed to excluded. So telling the whole story. One of the things I was thinking of the other day was the hypocrisy around kind of climate change. So there was a big thing a few years ago on you know, leaving your carbon footprint, the impact of air travel on that, and encouraging kind of staycations as opposed to kind of overseas travel on aeroplanes. But at the same time, we see them deporting people on near empty flights out of the country, and you're just like, you know, there's a bit of a hypocrisy going on in that. For me at the moment, social media, I think, has become an excellent source. And I think that's debatable. I think people may say, but I think information can be more easily accessed. And you can in some ways hold partial or biased authors to account. So I think that's a huge improvement. I think the Windrush scandal has really awakened a debate about, you know, the contribution of the so-called Commonwealth or common poor, not only kind of those who served in like the armed forces, but I mean, you know, recently, you know, I've been reading about other contributions that the Caribbean in particular made, contribution of oil from Venezuela, Trinidad, etc., you know, cocoa, oranges, etc., to make up kind of, you know, the food kits. It was a key route and resource for the wars. And also what many people don't know is there were bombs in the Caribbean and ships were sunk because Germany had hold of France. There were French and Dutch islands in the Caribbean, and it became very territorial. So opening up that kind of discussion around Windrush, scandal as it was, actually kind of gives people more information and the truth about kind of how we contributed there. I want to sort of end with the Grenfell Tower fire as an example of how that may be taught in the future. So what are we going to tell people about what happened at Grenfell Tower? And for me, it brings up things like, you know, are we going to talk about who lived there? You know, race has been left out of the terms of reference for the inquiry. So they're not looking at race, but you can see from the 72 victims what they predominantly look like. Is it a cladding story? The cladding on buildings has impacted many. But what are the stories and points behind that? You know, we should be looking at, you know, social housing, housing as a right, not a privilege. I think in there we really need to be talking about how we treat migrants, refugees and asylum seekers coming in to us. Will that story be told as part of Grenfell? We need to look at local authorities and central government and how they interact with the communities, what communities they deem valuable. Will we talk about deregulation, health and safety? Will we talk about privatisation and outsourcing of public outsourcing, and we see that even more now in the with the pandemic going on. Will there be a discussion around gender when we talk about Grenfell? Will we talk about truth and confidence in the criminal justice system? And while I mention inquiries, I think we need to look at who do inquiries benefit, because we've looked at inquiries from Aberfan in Wales to Piper Alpha to Hillsborough, and they're not real outcomes there. They're expensive, they have no legal recourse, the government doesn't have to act on any of the recommendations. So how will that story of Grenfell be told in the future? So for me, when we look through kind of, you know, the prism of the pandemic, the prism of Black Lives Matter, the prism of Grenfell, will we see that as a turning point? You know, is that the way that by telling the truth around those stories, do we kind of have a new solidarity in many ways, and a fresh kind of enthusiasm? And how do we keep hold of a strong and honest belief and the necessity, I think, of a better world? As I've already said to you, I hope that, you know, our society can be fuller and richer for my daughter's generation that it has been, that it's been for kind of many of us here. And I think education really counts in terms of how we go forward. So thank you for listening to me.
No, thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing so much with us, and your honesty as well in addressing some of those issues. We've had some